Two strangers wrote letters to their future spouses, and somehow I ended up falling in love with the man who wrote the one I wasn't supposed to get, but he already knew me long before I met him. I always believed some things in life arrive quietly the way dawn slips into a room without asking for permission, and maybe that is why the future spouse time capsule project never felt strange to me. Not when I was 19, not when my friends laughed about writing letters to a person who didn't exist yet, and not even when my professor insisted it would make sense one day. Because at that age, everything felt open, soft, unwritten. So when they handed us a sheet of thick cream-colored paper and told us to write to the person we might marry one day, I let my heart pour itself out, without thinking about who would eventually read those words. I wrote about things I never admitted out loud. The way I liked my morning to start slow and quiet. The way rainy days made me emotional but safe. The way I feared outgrowing people and being outgrown in return. I wrote that I wanted love. That felt like a long breath, not a storm. I wrote that I hoped he would be someone who listened with his whole soul. Even when my voice cracked, I sealed the envelope with a tiny nervous smile and slipped it into the wooden time capsule box, thinking I would get it back in 10 years. Maybe laugh at myself, maybe cry, maybe remember the girl I used to be. But life has a habit of shifting without telling you. And when the university mailed us our letters, a decade later, an envelope arrived at my door one spring morning, tied with a thin blue ribbon. I opened it eagerly, expecting my own handwriting to greet me, but the first line stopped my breath because it wasn't my letter. It wasn't my words. It wasn't my handwriting. Instead, it was a stranger's. Careful, gentle script addressed not to me but to the woman he hoped to marry someday. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a simple administrative mix-up. But as I kept reading, I felt myself sinking into the warmth of his words because he wrote with the kind of tenderness you rarely see in real life. He talked about wanting a partner who wasn't afraid to feel deeply and who would sit with him in silence under soft yellow light. He wrote that he hoped she would love music the way he did with quiet devotion, and he mentioned a fear of losing people through misunderstandings that never got resolved. And somehow every line felt eerily close to the shape of my own heart, like he was speaking to parts of me he should not know. I should have returned it. I should have emailed the department. I should have handed back the letter the way you return something you picked up by mistake. But instead, I folded it carefully and kept it tucked inside my drawer because something about that stranger's voice felt comforting, soothing, familiar in a way I couldn't explain. And I didn't know yet that keeping that letter would change the entire direction of my life. Would you keep a stranger's letter if it felt strangely meant for you? For days after that first reading, I kept opening the drawer just to peek at the edges of the envelope, like it was some fragile piece of fate that might disappear if I didn't check on it. And every time I touched it, I felt a strange flutter in my chest, the kind you get when something is about to shift inside your life, in a way you cannot name yet. And maybe that's why I kept rereading the letter, again and again, letting the words sink deeper into me until I almost memorized the loops of his handwriting and the rhythm of his hopes and fears. He had signed the letter with only his first name, Elias, a name that felt soft on my tongue, the kind of name you whisper without meaning to. And I remember sitting on my bed that evening, wondering what Elias was doing now, whether he had changed, whether he remembered writing this letter, or if it had been just another college assignment to him, while for me, it had somehow slipped under my skin. I thought about returning it many times, drafting emails in my mind, imagining the awkward exchange, but something in me hesitated every time because the truth was simpler and far more embarrassing. I didn't want to let the letter go. I didn't want to lose the voice of someone who felt like he had written from the same ache I carried inside of me, so I kept it folded carefully between two books, like a secret conversation I wasn't ready to end. Weeks passed and my life continued in its usual ordinary rhythm: work, errands, coffee. The small loneliness of evenings spent alone in a quiet apartment, but the letter became a warmth inside that quiet like a candle that never really burned out. And then something unexpected happened. The university sent another envelope, a formal apology explaining there had been a mix-up, and encouraging students to mail the letters back for resorting. But before I could overthink it, I took out a pen, and instead of returning the letter, I wrote a response. I told him I didn't know who he was or where he lived, but his words had reached someone who understood them deeply. I told him his softness felt like an echo of my own, and maybe that was why the letter felt strangely meant for me, even though logically it wasn't. I didn't sign my full name, just my first initial, and something about that anonymity made it feel like writing into a warm, safe space where expectations couldn't find me. I mailed it before I could change my mind, thinking maybe it would get lost, maybe it would never reach him, maybe it was foolish anyway, but it felt right in a way that made my heart feel less alone. And when a reply came 2 weeks later, in an envelope with familiar handwriting, my hands trembled because that meant he had written back to me, even though he didn't know who I was. And I didn't know yet that this small exchange would turn into years of letters that shaped the path of my heart long before I met the man who wrote them. Would you reply to a stranger's time capsule letter if it felt like your heart recognized their words? The first time I held his reply, I felt something inside me go very still, the way quiet settles over a lake, just before sunrise. And for a long moment, I simply sat on the floor, staring at the envelope like it was a doorway into something I wasn't sure I was ready to enter, but couldn't walk away from either. His handwriting looked the same, soft, patient, steady, and I opened it slowly, afraid the magic I had felt earlier would vanish once I read his words again. But instead, it deepened in a way that almost frightened me. He began by saying he wasn't sure if this letter would ever reach the right person, but he hoped it would find someone who needed it, someone who felt alone, in places they never admitted out loud. And then he thanked me for my response. Even though I hadn't told him my name, he said my words felt like talking to someone who understood the quiet parts of his heart without him having to translate them. He talked about the loneliness he carried growing up, the fear of being too much and not enough at the same time, and how he wrote that letter years ago from a place between hope and uncertainty, a place he thought only he lived in. Reading it felt like listening to someone speak in the same emotional language I had always used but rarely shared, and I found myself writing back almost immediately, not out of obligation, but because something inside me felt seen, in a way it hadn't been in a long time. Maybe ever. I told him I understood that in-between place, that strange ache that comes when you want connection but fear the weight of it. I said I didn't know why our letters had crossed, but maybe they were meant to land in the hands that needed them most, even if that wasn't the original plan. That single exchange became two, and then three, and then the start of something that didn't have a name yet but lived quietly between the pages of our letters, drifting into the corners of my everyday life, our words growing like ivy around the edges of days that might have otherwise felt ordinary. He told me about his love for soft jazz and early morning walks. I told him about my late-night poems and the way certain songs made me feel like my soul had lived many lives before this one. He told me he feared abandonment. I told him I feared disappointing people. He told me he believed some connections were born before people met. I told him I wasn't sure, but I wanted to believe that too. And time moved on like a slow river, years passing while our letters continued like a heartbeat, an invisible thread tying us together, even though we were strangers who had never stood in the same room, breathed the same air, or looked into each other's eyes. What I didn't know was that he already knew more about me than he ever admitted, and the truth behind it would one day shift the ground beneath my feet. Do you think two people can form a real connection through letters alone without ever meeting in person? The years passed in a slow, gentle rhythm, marked quietly by the arrival of envelopes, written in that same familiar handwriting. And sometimes I wondered if anyone else in the world felt this kind of connection with someone they had never met, someone who lived only in ink and soft confessions, and yet felt closer than many people who stood right in front of me in real life. And every time I opened one of his letters, it felt like opening a window into another version of myself, a version that was braver, softer, more honest, because with him, I didn't pretend, I didn't frame myself in careful sentences. I just existed, and he never pushed or probed. He simply received my words the way the ocean receives the tide. Steady, patient, never asking for more than I could give. He began sharing little pieces of his life, the coffee shop he loved, the park bench he always returned to when he needed to think, the fear he felt when he lost his father, the quiet pride he carried for his younger sister, the small joys that filled his days, like the sound of rain hitting the rooftop, or the way early morning sunlight slid through half-closed blinds. And I shared pieces of myself too, the loneliness I felt in crowded rooms, the friendships that faded quietly, the dreams I never said out loud because I feared they would unravel if spoken, the hope that maybe one day, love would feel like coming home instead of losing myself. Over time, our letters grew longer, more vulnerable, more like a shared diary than a simple exchange between strangers. And sometimes I wondered if I should ask to meet him, but something always stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was magic. Maybe it was the comfort of not risking reality because the world of letters felt untouched by disappointment, untouched by the messiness of real life. But then one day he asked a question that made my heart stop for a moment. He wrote, "Do you ever think we were supposed to meet? Or do you think this is enough?" I carried that letter around for days thinking about it, thinking about how his words had quietly rooted themselves in my world, how many lonely evenings his voice had filled, how many times his gentle thoughts had steadied me when life felt too heavy. And I finally wrote back saying, "I don't know if we were meant to meet, but sometimes it feels like I've known you far longer than these letters, and that scares me because I don't know what meeting would change." He didn't reply right away, which was unusual, and for the first time in years, I felt a strange emptiness, like the absence of something I had accidentally learned to rely on, until finally another envelope arrived one afternoon. And this time the tone was different, softer, heavier. He wrote, "I think some people walk into our lives long before their feet ever do, and I think you are one of them." I didn't know then that he meant those words far more literally than I understood, and that the truth behind our letters was something he had been holding close to his chest for years. Would you want to meet someone you'd written to for years, or would you keep the connection untouched and safe in words instead? I don't know when the shift happened. Maybe it was the way he always put his hand on my back when we crossed the street, like he was silently promising, "I've got you." Maybe it was the late-night conversations, where we talked about everything from childhood fears to the dumb reasons we cried at movies. Or maybe it was that rainy evening, the one I'll never forget. We were walking home after dinner, sharing an umbrella that was definitely too small for two people. He kept tilting it toward me, letting his shoulder soak. Instead, I told him he was being ridiculous. He just smiled. "You deserve to stay dry." My heart did a little somersault. When we reached my apartment building, I turned to thank him, but the words got stuck, because he was already looking at me. In that soft, unguarded way, people only look when they're fighting the urge to say something too big, too early. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, voice low. The air felt charged, like every streetlight dimmed just to hear him speak. "Yes," I whispered. He swallowed, hesitated. Then, "I feel like I've known you longer than I actually have." My breath caught, because I felt it too, that strange, aching familiarity, like our souls had brushed past each other long before our bodies did. But I wasn't brave enough to admit it. "Yeah," I said, trying to laugh it off. "Maybe we were next-door neighbors in a past life." He smiled, but his eyes, they stayed serious, almost sad. "Maybe," he murmured, "or maybe it's something else." Before I could ask what he meant, thunder cracked the sky open and we both jumped, laughing awkwardly, breaking the moment before it could swallow us whole. He walked me to my door, waited until I went inside, and only then turned away. I leaned against the closed door, my heart pounding like I'd run miles. Something was changing between us, something deep, something that scared me in the best possible way. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that he already understood exactly why everything felt so familiar. Because he had known me long before that rainy evening. He had known me since the moment he opened a letter that wasn't meant for him, but changed everything for both of us. A week later, something strange happened. I was cleaning out an old storage box, the kind filled with forgotten birthday cards, dried flowers, and random pieces of my past, when I noticed something missing. My future spouse time capsule letter. The one I wrote at 19. The one I sealed with a gold sticker and handed to the organizers with trembling hands. The one I poured my entire heart into. It wasn't there. I frowned, digging deeper into the box as if it might magically reappear, but no, it was gone. I knew I hadn't opened it. I knew I hadn't moved it. It simply wasn't. I shook my head, telling myself it didn't matter, that maybe the organizers still had it, that maybe I misplaced it years ago and never realized. But something about its absence made my chest tighten, because that letter, it wasn't just paper and ink, it was the purest version of me, the version who still believed in soulmates and destiny and all the things life later taught me to doubt. That night, I mentioned it to him. We were sitting on his kitchen floor, eating takeout because his dining table looked too clean to ruin. His apartment was dim and warm, a candle flickering on the counter like it belonged there. I think I lost my time capsule letter, I said casually, even though my heart felt anything but casual. He froze for a moment, just a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then he forced a small smile. Maybe they never returned it after the event. Maybe, I said, though the unease still lingered. He reached out and tapped my knee softly. Hey, whatever you wrote back then, I'm sure the person meant for you will still get it, one way or another. It was a strange thing to say, too specific, too certain. I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant, but he stood up quickly, clearing the takeout containers as if the conversation needed to be swept away with the trash. That night, as he drove me home, he was quieter than usual, thoughtful, distant in a way that didn't feel cold, just heavy. At my door, he paused, hands in his pockets. Can I ask you something? I nodded. What did you write in that letter? The one for your future spouse? My breath caught. Why did he want to know? Why did he look nervous asking? I smiled shyly, turning my gaze to the floor. Just things I wanted them to know about me. Stuff I didn't know how to say out loud. Dreams, fears, promises. When I looked back up, he was staring at me like every word I said was something he had already memorized long ago. Like he already knew, but that was impossible, right? He exhaled slowly, almost shakily. Someday, he said softly. I hope I get to hear it. My heart fluttered, confused, overwhelmed, unbelievably drawn to him. But as he walked away, disappearing into the night, I couldn't shake the thought. Why did it feel like he already had? Something changed after that night, and it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and creeping and soft, like fog rolling over a sleeping city. And I didn't even notice it at first because love, or the promise of love, has this strange way of blurring edges and making odd things feel normal as long as they come from the person whose heartbeat makes you pause in the middle of a sentence. He started showing up everywhere, not in a clingy way, not in a controlling way, but in a way that felt almost timed, perfectly timed. Like he always knew when I needed a warm hand reaching for mine, or when the loneliness in my chest grew too heavy, or when my days at work drained me enough that a cup of chai and a soft smile would feel like rescue. And every time he appeared at the exact moment I needed someone, it felt magical. The kind of thing romance novels get praised for, the kind of thing the old version of me believed in wholeheartedly. But deep down, a whisper started forming inside me. How does he always know? I tried brushing it away like dust on a windowsill because I didn't want to question something that felt so beautifully right. But that whisper didn't go away. It only grew softer and steadier, almost patient, like it was waiting for me to catch up. Then something strange happened again. We were walking back from a late-night movie, the city quiet around us except for the hum of distant traffic and the soft glow of street lamps stretching shadows across the pavement, when he asked me a question so random I almost laughed. What was the name of your childhood dog? I blinked because I had never told him that story, not even in passing, not even accidentally, and it wasn't the kind of detail you just guess. So I asked him gently, teasingly, suspiciously, why do you want to know that? He shrugged lightly but not casually because his shoulders felt too stiff for real nonchalance. Just curious, I guess. But curiosity doesn't make someone's voice tremble, and his did just slightly enough to make me stop walking and look up at him properly for the first time that evening, and when our eyes met, he looked almost scared or guilty, or maybe both, and I didn't understand why. My dog's name was Ginger, I said softly, watching his reaction, and he closed his eyes just for a moment, as if hearing something he already knew, as if confirming something, as if checking a box on an invisible list. A long breath escaped him, and he whispered, "That's a really sweet name." But his voice wasn't steady, and my heartbeat wasn't, either, because suddenly everything felt too strange to ignore. When we reached my building, he didn't ask to come up. He didn't linger like he usually did. He just pressed a quick kiss to my forehead and murmured goodnight, before turning away so fast it startled me. But before he got into his car, he paused with his hand on the door, his voice drifting through the quiet night. Your 19-year-old self. She wrote some beautiful things, didn't she? My entire body froze, because I had never told him what was in that letter. Not one word, not one line, not one memory, and yet he said it like he knew, like he had read it, but that letter was missing. And suddenly the whisper inside me wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a scream echoing through my chest as I stood there alone under the flickering streetlight, realizing that maybe the universe wasn't pulling us together. Maybe he was. The next morning, the world felt slightly tilted, not dramatically, not like something had shattered, but like a picture frame hanging just a little crooked on the wall. And no matter how much you try to ignore it, your eyes keep drifting back to it, because you know something is off, even if you can't explain it yet. And that was exactly how the day felt to me. Unsettling and quiet and full of small details that suddenly seemed too sharp to dismiss. I kept replaying his words the way he said your 19-year-old self wrote beautiful things, didn't she? And every time that sentence echoed in my mind, it scraped against something inside me, something protective, something ancient like an instinct, trying to warn me that the truth was closer to the surface than I wanted to believe. By afternoon, I couldn't focus on anything. Not my emails, not my coffee, not the half-finished script sitting on my laptop mocking me with its blinking cursor. And so I walked to clear my head, and even the city felt different. Somehow, too loud, too distant, too filled with people who looked like they were living their own stories, while mine suddenly felt like a puzzle. Someone else was quietly rearranging. I didn't want to doubt him. I didn't want to be that girl. I didn't want to break the gentle, fragile thing we were building. But something inside me whispered that love doesn't hide truths. Love doesn't tremble. Love doesn't know things it shouldn't know and pretend it doesn't. And that whisper grew heavier with each step I took through streets that should have felt familiar but somehow didn't anymore. When I got home, I sat on the floor with the storage box again, the same one where my missing letter should have been, and I emptied everything onto the carpet. Old tickets, photos, bracelets, hair clips, birthday notes from friends, and underneath it all, a thin layer of dust that shouldn't have been there if something hadn't been moved recently. And my hand started shaking because the implication felt too close, too real, too impossible. Someone had opened this box. Someone had taken the letter. Someone had read it, and only one person made sense. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like it echoed in the small room, and in that moment, something inside me shifted like a lock, finally turning after resisting for too long, and the clarity that rushed in was almost overwhelming, because I realized I couldn't keep pretending this was normal, or romantic, or destiny when it felt so frighteningly deliberate. I needed answers. That evening, I called him and asked if he could meet me at the cafe near my building, a place filled with warm lights and quiet corners, where confessions felt softer and truths felt less cruel, and he agreed instantly, his voice sweet and steady, in a way that made the dread twist tighter in my stomach because it didn't match the fear simmering beneath the surface of everything. When he walked in, he looked nervous, but trying not to be the way someone looks when they're rehearsing calmness, and when he sat across from me, his eyes searched my face like he was trying to read my thoughts before I could say them out loud, and that alone confirmed more than I wanted to admit. "I need to ask you something," I said softly, and the tremor in my voice was impossible to hide. He nodded slowly, swallowing hard like he already knew where this was going. "Did you ever see my time capsule letter?" The air between us tightened instantly like the whole room was holding its breath, and he didn't answer, not at first, not in words, but the way his body froze, the way his lips parted and closed again, the way guilt flickered through his eyes for the briefest unguarded second was enough to make my chest ache with the truth. But he still whispered, "Why would you think that?" Even though he said it too quickly, too defensively, too much like a lie someone wants to be believed, even when they know it won't be. I stared at him, searching his face for the boy I'd fallen for and the boy I hoped he still was. And in a voice that barely held together, I whispered the question that terrified me most. "Did you know me before we met?" His breath hitched, and that was the moment my world shifted completely because the silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was admission. The silence between us stretched so long it felt like the cafe walls were slowly closing in, and every second he didn't answer made the truth bloom darker and clearer inside my chest until I could barely breathe because he wasn't confused, he wasn't surprised. He wasn't hurt by the question, he was terrified of the answer, and that alone made my heartbeat stumble in a way I knew I could never unfeel no matter how this night ended. He looked down at his hands like he was searching for courage somewhere in the lines of his palms, and for a moment he didn't speak. He just sat there breathing too shallow, too uneven, like someone trapped between confession and fear, and I didn't move either because something told me the next words he said would change everything and I wasn't ready, and yet I desperately needed to know. Finally, he whispered almost too quietly to hear, "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." My entire body tensed because people only say that when they've already crossed a line and regret isn't enough to erase it, and my chest tightened painfully as I forced myself to stay still, stay calm, stay focused. Even though my heart was pounding so loudly it felt like it was shaking through my ribs, I swallowed hard. Happened like what? He still didn't look up. He still didn't meet my eyes. He still looked like a boy drowning in the truth he had tried to keep hidden. "I didn't plan to fall for you," he said quietly. "That wasn't supposed to happen." My breath caught. My pulse stuttered and a chilling thought slid into my mind like cold water down my spine. "What was supposed to happen?" I whispered. He flinched. Actually flinched. Like the question hit him physically. Then he finally lifted his eyes, and the sadness in them was so deep and so raw that for a second I almost forgot to be afraid. But fear came rushing back when he said, "I read your letter long before we met." The world didn't explode. It didn't collapse. It didn't scream. It just went still. So still that I could hear the faint buzz of the cafe refrigerator and the sound of a spoon clinking in someone's mug, and my own heartbeat beating too loudly in my ears as his words sank deeper and deeper into the space between us. He kept talking, his voice trembling, almost breaking. "I didn't steal it. I swear that wasn't how it happened. I found it by accident years ago at the program office when they were moving buildings. It was in a pile of unclaimed things, and when I saw your name, something just made me pick it up, and I shouldn't have opened it. But I did, and once I read it, He swallowed hard, his eyes shining with regret, his breath shaking. "I felt like I already knew you." My throat tightened painfully because that letter wasn't just ink and hope. It was a map of who I was back then, before time. And disappointment changed me, and he had looked at it without my permission, without my trust, without my knowing, and he let that shape everything. And the betrayal was so intimate, so personal, that my chest actually hurt. I forced words out through the ache. "So you knew me before that day at the bookstore?" He nodded slowly, fearfully. "Yes, and you planned to meet me." Another nod. Smaller, shaking. My voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice broke completely. "Because I thought you'd run, and I couldn't bear the idea of losing you before I even had a chance." The cafe around us blurred, like someone smeared the edges of the moment because I was staring at the boy I'd been falling for and realizing he had been walking toward me long before I ever saw him. And that wasn't fate or coincidence or destiny. It was design. It was orchestration. Careful, intentional, orchestrated steps. And I didn't know whether to cry or run or demand the truth down to every last detail of how deeply he had shaped the path that brought us together. But I managed one more question, my voice barely a breath. "What else did you do to make sure you found me?" His silence answered before he did, and it wasn't gentle. He didn't speak at first, and that silence wrapped around us like something thick and trembling and full of answers he wasn't ready to offer. And I sat there watching his chest rise and fall, too fast, too uneven, as if every breath carried a truth he had been holding back for far too long, and the weight of it pressed against the small table between us, until I could almost hear my heartbeat echoing against the wood. When he finally looked up, there was a kind of surrender in his eyes, the soft breaking of someone who had run out of places to hide, and his voice slipped out in one slow exhale as he whispered, "I never meant for things to go this far." It wasn't enough. Not nearly, but it cracked something open. "What things?" I asked gently, though my voice trembled in a way I couldn't hide. His hands tightened together, his knuckles turning pale like he needed to hold on to something solid before he fell apart, and he said, "I didn't know you when I found the letter. Not really. I didn't know the shape of your voice, or the way you smiled, or the way you paused before saying something honest. I only knew the girl in that envelope, and I should have walked away, but I couldn't because I felt something I'd never felt before." My breath hitched because every word he said drew a line between love and trespass, and I could feel both pulsing in the space between us. "So you read it," I whispered. "You read the letter meant for my future spouse." He nodded once, a small, fragile movement. I shouldn't have, but when I did, something inside me just aligned. I don't even know how to explain it. "You wrote like someone waiting for a person who might never come, and I thought maybe I could be that person. Maybe fate had handed me something I wasn't supposed to ignore." My heart hurt with a quiet, sharp ache, because those were the exact kinds of words that used to make me believe in destiny, but hearing them now felt different, heavier, like a dream that had been twisted before I ever stepped into it. "You knew me before we met?" I said softly. "Yes," he breathed. "I knew the pieces of you that letter carried, and I kept thinking that if life wanted us to collide, it would happen without force. I told myself I wouldn't interfere, but then one day I saw you in the bookstore, and it felt like the universe whispered, 'This is the moment,' and I took it." I remember that day more vividly now, the warmth of coincidence, the softness of connection, but knowing now that he had been waiting for that moment made the memory warp at the edges, like a photograph left too long in the sun. "Why did you never tell me?" I asked. His voice cracked. "Because the moment you laughed with me, the moment you trusted me even a little, I was terrified you'd disappear if you knew the truth, and I didn't want to lose the chance to love you without the shadow of my mistake standing between us." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle inside me. The love that felt real, the betrayal that felt raw, the confusion threading through both so tightly I couldn't untangle which feeling belonged to which moment. When I finally stood up, my voice came out barely a whisper. "I need space to understand what all of this means." He rose as if to follow, but something in my expression stopped him, and for the first time since our story began, he let me walk away without trying to shape what happened next.